Now, there's a whole swag of legislation which you need to be aware of, and I could probably do an entire talk on that subject. The important things, I think, are things like the Queensland Development Code, which for residential developments and commercial developments requires that a developer provide an alternative water source. In many cases, in most cases, that's interpreted as a rainwater tank. And a lot of people think that rainwater tanks are mandatory under those codes. But in fact, it's the alternative source which is mandatory, not rainwater tanks. So stormwater harvesting could well be the alternative source that's implemented to avoid the need for rainwater tanks. And we'll come back to that a bit later. There's a whole bunch of rules under the Water Supply Safety and Reliability Act, which relate to people that supply water being water service providers. That's where the responsibilities are enshrined in legislation. And there's also this SPP Healthy Waters, which I believe has just recently been formalised, and the related interim guideline number 7 under the South East Queensland Regional Plan, which are the frequent flow guidelines. And essentially they say that under certain circumstances, the first 10 or 15 millimetres of runoff from impervious surfaces should be captured, and at the moment I think the words are managed. Now, if you interpret managed as reused, then that is stormwater harvesting. So there is legislation which is pushing towards greater interest in things like stormwater harvesting. The question of cost. Everybody always wants to know, engineers always want to know how much it's going to cost. One of the interesting things is looking at the cost of water on your water bill. And there's a thing that you can see on the Queensland Water Commission website called the bulk water price path. The bulk price path, whatever it is, for water. Anyway, it's the price that the grid manager charges the distribution agencies for bulk water. They add their margin on top of that for distribution, but it's the price that they pay for treated water supplied into their system. And so you can see it there. That's the bulk price path for water. They only quote it up to about 2017, so at the moment we've just drawn it as a flat line beyond that. It will have inflation built in, but we don't know what it'll be. If you add the authority's price, then you get a price like that. So what that says is that at the moment we're paying, we're approaching $3 a kilolitre for water in total, but within another 10 years we could be paying over $4 a kilolitre, regardless of what happens. Oh, sorry, no, that's the... And if you add inflation to that, then that takes over $5 a kilolitre. So one of the challenges always has been that water's been too cheap, which has discouraged investment in new sources, and as you can see, that we're slowly redressing that problem. But it may not be good for consumers, but it's good for the water industry because it means that incentive is introduced to do things differently and do better. Just for comparison, I've put a recent estimate of, and these are operating costs, supply costs, a recent estimate for the Fitzgibbon Stormwater Harvesting Project as a projection over time. And you can see that initially it looks like we might be more expensive than the town water, but over time, with the changes that are expected, particularly in the bulk price, it starts to look quite attractive. So the equation is difficult, but it is changing as we go forward. Another interesting cost number comes from a study that was done by Bligh and Design Flow for the Queensland Water Commission last year, and it's got this horrible title called Stormwater Infrastructure Options to Achieve Multiple Water Cycle Outcomes. So if anybody can remember that, they're doing really well. But it did look at traditional stormwater systems versus stormwater systems with stormwater harvesting to try and get an idea of what the incremental change to the costs are as you go from one system to the other. Now, what that shows is that the gross cost, this is CapEx and O&M costs for sort of best practice current stormwater drainage systems, including rainwater tanks, is around, what's that, $170,000 per hectare. If you introduce stormwater harvesting and just use it locally, then that does go up to about 220. But if you can harvest and distribute the water somewhere else, in other words, augment a water supply system, then there's the potential for that cost measure to be reduced. So this is what we have to do now anyway. This is what we're looking to do in the future with stormwater harvesting. And on looking at those sorts of numbers, and I accept they're a bit simplistic, it's not an increased impost. Another way of looking at it is the cost per megalitre of water, and these are levelised costs, including capital and operating costs. So again, if you take current best practice, the cost per megalitre is quite high. I mean, that's because we're really only getting what we're getting out of rainwater tanks, which is a relatively small volume. But if you can introduce stormwater harvesting and get significant yields, then the cost per megalitre drops by a factor of 4 or 5. So there's, it's the old challenge of statistics. How do you best present data to recognise the real issues? And this is a really important one, because people are being required to invest $5,000 or $6,000 in a rainwater tank. And if you don't need a rainwater tank, then that provides that much money that's available to the community to spend on an alternative water supply system. So it gives you something to play with as a basis for planning your scheme. Now, I'm conscious that I'm well over the half hour, so nobody's gone to sleep yet, so that might be a reasonably good sign. Okay. So that's a chart I really wanted to do, which is to compare stormwater harvesting with all these other sources. But you can see I've got, you can see numbers there, but it's too hard to get those numbers. They're top secret in government. You just can't get them. So that doesn't say anything. So just a couple of quick things on a couple of existing projects. The one that's under construction at the moment for us is this South Bank Stormwater Harvesting and Reuse Centre, the Shark project, which this is not a bad photo really, because it's pinched off the web, but it shows a storm over South Bank, and our project sits in the shadow of the wheel, just in the bushes down there. And if you walk past, you can see the construction activity underway at the moment, and hopefully this will be up and running within about 4 months. So it's progressing quite quickly. The reason it's being built is that when the drought hit and restrictions were imposed, South Bank essentially lost all their irrigation water in one fell swoop. So the amount of water that they had available to them for irrigation, the green line, went from about 250 down to about 50 kilolitres per day. Not sure about that number, but anyway, that unit. And that 50 there is all from their swimming pool backwash. So for the last 4 or 5 years, South Bank Irrigation has relied on backwash water from their swimming pool and water tankered in from South Caboolture Recycled Water Plant. So you can see that they had a legitimate concern about the drought security of their water supply. So they went looking for an alternative. And after a lot of usual mucking around, we've ended up with this stormwater harvesting project, right under the middle of everything there, and pumping it across into a 2 megalitre storage tank with a plant room tucked in next to the arbour under the shadow of the wheel, which sits there in this photo. So that's essentially the plan, and then the treated water will be pumped from there and distributed back through the site for landscape irrigation, toilet flushing and water features.